Pleasure to meet everyone. I thank you very much for hosting me. Um, feel very fortunate to be able to speak with you at the Williams Institute. I'm very familiar with your institute and all the excellent top-notch work, of course, that you do both in the US and abroad. And so, again, I'm very humbled to be here and to be able to have a conversation with what I hope I can consider a group amongst friends, just to think about what's going on in Turkey, give us some backstory as to what the situation is, and then focus primarily on what activists in the country are doing, and maybe some lessons that we can learn as it relates to maybe similarities to what's happening here in the United States, in Western Europe, and then differences as well. So at any point, again, I'll give some primary information, but if I'd be happy at any time to stop and have a conversation as well about what is taking place. And so when I wrote this book, I was initially interested in understanding what to me seemed like a very exciting and yet difficult to understand at first situation with regards to Turkey. Within the Muslim world, there's very little support for LGBTI or LGBTI rights. And I'll get into reasons why this is. Turkey was one of the rarer exceptions. What I noticed in Turkey was that from the early 2000s, this is one of the states that, in the Muslim world, that not only did not ban homosexuality, but also allowed a pride parade to take place. And so I thought, here's a situation where you have, on the one hand, a country that is governed by an Islamist party, a conservative Islamist party, and on the other hand, still allowing for LGBTI pride marches and pride parades to take place. And so I wanted to understand how did they get to this point, and then what I also started to notice was the regression of LGBTI rights in Turkey. If we look at the current situation in Turkey today, you have a history of LGBTI-based activism that actually isn't very long in terms of its age. You might argue that this goes back to the mid to late 1980s, where you see one of the first LGBT protest movement. It was a hunger strike that actually didn't get much attention at all. It's only later now that people are referring back to that moment. In the early 90s is when you start to see the initial activist LGBT organizations or LGBTI organizations forming in Turkey. So the activist organizations themselves are not but a couple of decades old. If you look at the law within Turkey, as I mentioned, Turkish law does not prohibit LGBTI, homosexuality, as a problem in its society, quote unquote. This goes back to the Ottoman Empire. In the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire decriminalized homosexuality based on the Napoleonic Code. Ataturk, the secular leader in the early 1900s, 1923, confirmed this, and so Turkey actually has a long history of support at that legal level for LGBTI rights. Yet what you start to see happen here is that in around 2002, the winning of the elections by a group called the AKP, or the Justice and Development Party. This is an Islamist party who has come to power and has stayed in power from 2002 to presently. This is a group that wants to merge Islam with government. And so the term political Islam is a varied and complex term. There's variations of what this could look like. You have violent Islamists like ISIS, like the Taliban, and you have nonviolent Islamists like the AKP, who through nonviolence want more Islam in government. Whether this means teaching of Islam, whether it means a hijab issue, as it was well noted in Turkey. And the Turkish government, since the rise of the AKP, has made life for the LGBTI community, very difficult. This can be seen in their day-to-day, in daily activities, in significant statements that have been taking place. Just to give you some examples, when people advocate for LGBTI rights in Turkey, the AKP party, time and time again, has provided statements suggesting that LGBTI rights are not compatible with Turkish society or Turkish culture. And the continued references are statements such as, quote unquote, society is not ready, or it goes against the culture of what Islam is. So what they attempt to do, this Islamist party, attempts to use the narrative of Islam to argue against for LGBTI equality, LGBTI rights in society. So this is a narrative I'd be happy to talk more about, but throughout the years, this is what has continued to be done. That they continue to frame it in a situation that is contrary to the religion. So by attempting to take the moral position of the faith in their mind as a conservative Islamic party, they feel that they're speaking for the religion and making it very difficult for LGBTI community members in Turkey. And the situation in public opinion is not much better. There's been studies done by Pew and others that have looked at questions in the Middle East and elsewhere with regards to how do you feel about LGBTI rights? And one of the questions they ask is, how would you feel about having an LGBT neighbor next to you? And continuously, since the early 2000s, Turkey's one of the only countries that has progressively gotten worse. That 87%, if I remember the number correctly, do not want a neighbor to be LGBTI. And many of the individuals in society feel that it's contrary to their culture and contrary to their religion. So that was intriguing to me as a scholar to see, on the one hand, you have legal conditions in place for rights, and yet a society that, by and most part, wants nothing to do with the LGBTI as neighbors. And so I wanted to understand, how do activists work in this situation? How do they bridge this gap between members of the society who are not identifying as LGBTI? What particularly struck me was not only focus on Turkish law, but then what happened in 2015. From 2015 was the first moment that the government stopped the Pride Parade with force. Up until then, from the early 2000s to 2015, LGBTI individuals could carry out and be involved in the Pride March. Non-LGBTI individuals who are allies could be in the Pride March. Turkey Istanbul Pride March was the most popular in the Middle East. At its height, it was roughly 100,000 people would take part in this march. And from 2015, now the government repeatedly, year after year, has repressed the Pride March. Initially, you hear, and there's two primary arguments that they continue to use that go on to this day. Just 2 days ago, there was an attempt at another Pride March, and the forces in Istanbul said, we'll let you read a speech, but then you have to stop. So the activists read the speech and then wanted to proceed in the protest, and they used tear gas against the protesters. This has taken place from 2015 until 2019. And the two arguments that they use are that this march is, one, a threat to security and safety, that by you doing this, this could potentially lead to insecurity by individuals challenging. So in the name of protecting the community, they're actually using it as an excuse for them to not protest and not march. And the second is that they use the Islam argument again. In 2015-16, you see that the Pride March took place during the month of Ramadan. This is a holy month for Muslims where they abstain from drinking and eating from sunrise to sunset, from dawn to sunset. And the government said, well, you shouldn't do this during the month of Ramadan. So they use this Islam narrative again. The problem with that is, one, that they are dictating the terms of Islam, and second of all, that even in the years after, where Ramadan doesn't fall in the Pride March, they're still attempting to do that. So this is how the government is continuing to do this. And as I said, today it was hundreds of people that were out in the street and that were quickly repressed by the authorities. So the government has been able to stifle activists from over 100,000 in the street to now hundreds, maybe in the low thousands. And so these are the situations, these are the conditions that the community is now dealing with. So for this book that came out in late 2018, early 2019, I did qualitative interviews with a number of LGBTI activists in Turkey through Skype and also on the ground in Turkey. So I started in spring 2015, went during the summer of 2015 in Istanbul, and then followed up in the spring of 2016 via Skype. I wanted to go back, but for those that might be familiar with Turkey, the government under the Erdogan regime has gotten increasingly authoritarian. There was an attempted coup that he has now used to repress almost anybody who has challenged the regime. So I was able to speak with a number of leaders of the different LGBTI organizations, Pembe Hayat, which is a well-known transgender-focused LGBTI organization, SPOD, which is a social programs group, ListTag, which is friends and family of LGBTI individuals, so I'll talk about them as well, KSGL, 2 municipality leaders, and a founder of the Gay Zone magazine, which is an online LGBTI publication. So through this different spectrum, I wanted to understand what sorts of activist strategies. And these are the questions I was asking them. In the midst of a government whose laws are quite repressive, what do you do? Because this is the conditions that they're facing. If you look at the law, while it's not illegal to be LGBTI, in Article 10 of the Constitution, it calls for the equality and calls for protecting equality of all individuals based on race, based on religion, based on nationality, based on gender, except for based on sexual orientation. The government will not put that language in the Constitution, and this is something that the LGBTI activists have been fighting for. There are laws in place in Turkey where if you commit a crime against someone who's LGBTI, you can evoke a provocation law, where you were provoked, quote unquote, by someone who's LGBTI, and your sentence is reduced often, quite drastically. Murder sentences can be reduced by significant years because of that based argument. There are censorship laws in place where you can't form associations if it's deemed unethical. Well, who gets to decide what's ethical and what's not? The state often uses this. You have a radio and broadcasting entity who monitors what's on the internet. And they've tended to ban sites like Grindr and gay.com because it didn't fit within the narrative of the state. So I wanted to ask these individuals, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of this crackdown, what strategies are you taking? What methods are you using? And the answer I found was, we're using a range of approaches to advocate for LGBTI rights. The organization started in the early 2000s, but it was 2013 that really started to get heightened awareness for LGBTI rights. In 2013 in Turkey, there were these protests called the Gezi Park protest. Erdogan, the Turkish leader, wanted to build this mosque in this green space in Istanbul. There's very limited green space, and he wanted to build this mosque in the heart of this area, Gezi Park and Taksim Square, to show his Islamic connection. This is a party who, one individual of the party made a comment saying that the secular era of Turkey from Ataturk until 2002 was a commercial in the history of the Ottoman Empire, in the history of Turkey. Meaning, it's just a blip, it's just a variation of the norm of what is Islam in Turkish society. So this is the mindset in which we have to keep in mind. But it was in 2013 that the activists from environmentalists who were upset by economic policies, gender activists, LGBTI activists, all of them came together, pro-Democrats, all of them came together and started to protest the Erdogan regime. And this is where you start to see linkages between those who were Muslim, those who were secular, those who were LGBTI, all of them starting to work together, networking, maybe for the first time, all against this common actor, which is the regime. So 2013 was interesting because shortly after 2013, you start to see heavy mobilization. You start to see heavy mass mobilization from LGBTI activists. And they started to look through different approaches. They started to look through legislation. You have a lot of lawyers now who are focused on working to change Article 10, working to work within the European Court of Human Rights to put pressure on the Turkish state. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Turkey began to be more open to LGBTI organizations and start to reconsider Turkish law. Part of the reason was they wanted to get into the European Union. Whether that's the case today, I would argue not the same way. But because of this, you started to see a freeing of space that LGBTI activists then moved into and started advocating for these rights issues. So what they're doing is working with legislators. They would admit, we'd go to legislative circles, and first of all, people wouldn't even shake our hands, they would say, because they were under the assumption that if you shook a hand with someone who's LGBT, that you could catch homophobia. That was the perception. That still is a prevailing position among some in Turkey, that it is still treated as a sin or as a disease. But that's the narrative that they're fighting. And they've been able to push forward and work with municipalities. The rival party to the AKP is the People's Republican Party. Just these past couple of days, they've started to post pictures of LGBT rights, rainbow flags, to provide support for the community. The AKP party is furious with this. They're posting counter protests, but this is one of the first cases where municipalities throughout Turkey that are not governed by the AKP are so openly supportive of LGBT rights. And I think a lot of this stems from their years of on-the-ground activism, meeting with officials, trying to get meetings, speaking in front of municipalities, saying, look, these are the issues. We're trying to show our visibility in this case. And it's worked. You've had two individuals who, one of which is a council person for one of the districts, Beşiktaş, and the other, he passed away, he was an advisor to the mayor of another well-known district. And by them running in elections, by them working within the municipalities, they start to say, look, one, we're increasing our visibility. We want LGBTI to know that there's access points available to them. The community never felt that there was any open space to be able to even go in a government building. One of the activists even said when she went into her position, has a trans person ever come into this building? And the response was, to our knowledge, no. Well, why do you think that is? So these individuals are working within the municipalities to post on social media, to get individual politicians to sign documents saying that they're LGBTI friendly. And this is where it's come to, in the sense of now public officials are much more openly supportive of these based issues. So they're working within the law. In addition, they're working on visibility politics. As I'm sure we're all aware, visibility politics is a very important strategy for LGBTI activism. In Turkey, you saw very little mention of LGBTI communities at all in society. The argument was even less than 10 years ago, there'd be almost no mention. Not good, not bad, nothing. As if they didn't exist in society. And you're starting to see more mention of this now. Part of this stems from the fact that they're working with journalists. A lot of these organizations, what they'll do is they'll have training sessions for journalists to first introduce them to members of the community and the activists, saying, look, we're here, these are the struggles, these are the issues that we're dealing with. We want you to be aware of this, and to be put on the radar of journalists. So you're starting to see more of this. You're starting to see more attention to LGBTI activism in the news. You're starting to see more individuals in terms of hosting shows or being anchors on news or running in elections. And through this media visibility, you're starting to see more attention raised in this capacity. This has been a success, I think, as well, that in Turkey, that the media is picking this up more. They're willing to sit down and they're willing to hear the plight of the LGBTI community, whereas before that wasn't the case. You're starting to see it, and they're still working on it. In my interviews with the online magazine, his point was, look, we don't want to even talk about politics right now. We just want to show the everyday lives of individuals so that people know that they're there. Because it's been so suppressed in society. And therefore, that attention is still the approach that's taken. So they'll work with celebrities. They'll get major Turkish celebrities to talk about LGBTI issues. So individuals who never thought of LGBTI issues or didn't even know what the acronym stands for, and most in Turkey don't, according to their belief, now can say, well, this person supports it, let me think more about it. I mean, we see this in the US, of course, the power of celebrities, for better or worse, as we can understand. This is what's starting to happen in Turkey. They're focusing on education. Heavy attention to education in local municipalities. As I mentioned before, they're training individuals with regards to schooling. They're bringing attention to health issues. These are the health issues that are going on in the LGBTI community. Here are the difficulties of why transgender individuals can't get access to healthcare. It often stems from laws in place with regards to changing identity. It's very difficult for trans individuals to change identity on their card, on their identification. The Turkish government has made it very difficult. And if you don't do that, you don't get access to health services. So they're training individuals, they're training doctors to be aware of all of this. Many doctors initially wouldn't treat LGBTI individuals, even though it's against, as scholars have mentioned, it's against their oath to do so. Doctors wouldn't treat LGBTI individuals. They're training doctors. They're training security guards at buildings to say this is how you should treat individuals when they come in. This is how you should not stereotype or generalize. All these intricacies are now, I believe, starting to pay off with education. But again, it's still a challenge. It's still a very difficult challenge, in part because so much of Turkish society is still unaccepting of the LGBTI community. One of the other things that they're doing are socioeconomic programs. So much attention is given to socioeconomic programs as a primary mechanism of support because so many individuals are intersected with poverty. Many of the LGBTI community is and does have challenges getting access to employment. Or if they get access to employment and the employer finds out that they're LGBTI, they could be fired based on that ethical position that I alluded to earlier. So you saw this in a case with a police officer, you saw it in a case with a teacher, when it was found out by their employer that they were within the LGBTI community, that they lost their positions. These sorts of challenges happen. And so they're looking for raising awareness, but at the same time, so much of the plight of the community is on healthcare, is on housing. Take the transgender community. The police often will use a law to round up individuals that they deem are challenging the ethics of society. So basically they'll target transgender individuals, accuse them of prostitution, go into homes, reports of violence. When landlords find out that LGBTI individual was living there, they'll often get kicked out of they've been kicked out of their apartments. Often individuals will have to bring someone who's not LGBTI to get access to the apartment so they can live there. These sorts of challenges. So these communities are now struggling with, how do we help transgender individuals? How do we help the LGBTI who's impoverished? How do we give them food? How do we give them health? How do we give them shelter? This is what I found particularly interesting. When I was doing research, one of the questions asked is, well, in the West, there's a lot of focus on the issue of same-sex marriage. And the response is, why would we talk about same-sex marriage as a priority for us? Of course we want it, but there's reasons they won't go there. There's a couple, and primarily. One is, we're worried about getting killed. We're worried about ISIS bombing our offices. Not that LGBTI marriage equality is not important, they say, but we just need to prioritize our resources. And our priority, they say now, is providing shelter, providing health services, providing job opportunities for individuals. So that's one of the challenges that I found particularly interesting. And they even argued that it's really a Western-based approach. They were quite critical that they felt that this is something Western activists talk too much about and don't understand the economic issues. And this is something I'd be very interested to have a conversation about. So that was one point. And the second was, well, if we focus on that issue, that's fodder for the government to say, look, this is all they care about. The only thing they want to do is get married with one another in the streets and make it public. They don't want to be framed in that narrative. Repeatedly, they'd say, of course, we're not opposed to it, but we have to be careful with how we use our resources. And we know if we advocate for this position, then the government's going to say those things, and it's going to neglect all the troubles and challenges that the community is facing. So that's something I found really interesting, and a point of tension with Western activists, that many in the West, primarily those who are funding a lot of these issues, want to talk about gay marriage, want to talk about marriage equality, and again, not that they don't want to, but they say, look, we have other pressing needs that we want to focus on. So I want to leave you with some of the challenges. I think there's a lot of great work that's been done, but there are still a lot of things that still need to be taking place for complete equality in Turkish society. One is a lack of funding. They just don't have resources, which can be a challenge in activism throughout the world. They talk about this repeatedly, where we don't have sufficient office space. We have very limited funds to pay full-time employees. Many of them were volunteers, and when you have significant volunteers, sometimes it's difficult to gain continuity in your work and your activism. People are coming, they're leaving, they're looking for paid employment opportunities, so the network doesn't get built up the same way. So they found that this was a challenge. On the other hand, they're careful where they get their funding. If they get it from governments, they know what that looks like. So they're very mindful of where funding is coming from. But this is one of the challenges. If they get it from a government, they're worried about the perception, and that could be used by the Islamist government. If they don't get government funding, or if they don't get outside funding, then they know that there's very limited funding available. So they're working on trying to get these sorts of funding positions, but that's always a risk and a challenge. There are ongoing threats. As I mentioned, the government has continued to be, in my mind, to be more and more repressive. Post the coup attempt, Erdogan has shut down journalists, has shut down professors, has jailed professors, has targeted protesters, and has not made it easy on the LGBTI community. And I worry that that fear is still in place. And we saw it with the recent attempts at the Pride March. In addition, as I mentioned as well, the Islamic State, a couple of years back now, there was a document in which they put out that they were going to potentially target different groups. Well, the military got a hold of this document, and one of the LGBTI groups was on that document. And so a number of the groups had to abandon their offices for a few weeks, but think of that challenge. By abandoning their offices, I asked them, well, you could work at home, of course. And they said, yes, but where does the transgender individual with no money go when they have nowhere to turn? Where do individuals go when they need resources for health? It's not the same, of course. And so they finally went back to their offices, but this was the risk that was taking place. And so you still have a lot of these conservative elements in society who continue to make threats. You have this, if I'm not mistaken, Muslim Anatolia group who go out in public and shout derogatory statements towards LGBTI. Others who are advocating for the wiping away of this community in Turkish society based on the notion of Islam. I asked them about that. I said, well, why don't you use Islam? And this was an argument I was making, and in the book I made, that I believe that one strategy they should be using, and I'm always careful as an outsider to make recommendations, but I thought that could be the language that could work. That could be the language, to speak within the language of Islam. And they said, look, we're open to it, but we don't know that discourse. We're trained in international secular law. We don't know Islam. And so it's tough for us to have that conversation with imams or religious clerics who are trained in Islam. And yet I find when there are Muslims who are speaking out for LGBTI rights, whether it's imams or individuals in society, then individuals are more prone to listen. You see a lot of this literature here. Harrison and Mickelson, if I'm not mistaken, did this study where they look at in-group relations, and so they ask these questions, I believe it was in the United States, where are you supportive of LGBTI rights? And then they asked, are you supportive of LGBTI rights? By the way, a famous ball player in your town is supportive of it. And they found the numbers rise drastically. That if you're connected, if they find connectivity, we saw this in Ireland with the vote, where one of the biggest factors for advocacy for same-sex marriage in Ireland were the clergy. They were coming out and speaking favorably of this. In South Africa, you see this with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Alan Bosak, who have been willing to speak out against the church, speak out in favor of LGBTI rights. If I'm not mistaken, Archbishop Tutu calls it the new apartheid. It's that important of an issue. He also said that if God is opposed to this, then this is not a heaven or a God he wants to believe in. I mean, these are the sorts of needed statements I believe that people are making, and I believe the Muslim community is not there. And that's where I feel that there's this gap. So the need for the Muslim community to say, look, it's not a sin. It is necessary that within the Islamic context that this is something that is clearly important, clearly necessary for equal rights, and that it's not something that God is opposed to. These sorts of positions, I believe, will have success, and it will challenge the Islamists who are right now dominating the narrative there. The last point I want to make is that there are challenges with maintaining ties of different NGOs. One individual activist made a point to me. He said, I worry that there's a rift between the LGBT and the T organizations, that the transgender community feels marginalized even within the LGBT community as a whole, that there's much more attention given to lesbian, gay, bisexual rights issues and not as much as transgender. Or during the Pride March, people will dress in clothing that they feel transgender individuals identify with every day, and yet people are doing it for a Pride march and are overlooking the entire fact that these are individuals' identities, sexual identities that they relate to on an everyday basis. So they feel that there's a disconnect, and one in particular mentioned that he worried that if the larger LGBT community doesn't bring in the transgender and their issues, then it's going to get fractionalized, it's going to get marginalized. One other individual made a point. If you look at the group Chaos GL, gay lesbian, they won't even add the T. Despite protests to add T at the end of your name, they haven't done it yet. So there are marginal fractionalizations within these organizations. The communication could be improved upon, they themselves admit. And this is something moving forward that they've talked about, and hopefully they'll continue to do. So again, I just wanted to bring awareness to the issue of the history of Turkish LGBTI rights, the challenges that they're facing, and then some strategies that I believe are working, and then places where I believe additional rights issues could still be improved upon. And again, I'm very concerned because of the continued authoritarianism of the regime, that this is an issue that's going to get marginalized, overlooked, that the community is going to continue to be oppressed with. And we're seeing this just with a couple days ago with the ongoing use of tear gas against individuals for the Pride March. So I thank you very much for your time. I'm genuinely humbled and appreciative, and I look forward to any conversation and questions that you may have. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the role of the courts.
Yes.
Of course, in the United States, the courts have been both positive and negative towards LGBTI rights, and has been increasingly a strategy to utilize. I understand that in Turkey under Erdogan, the courts have become increasingly political and less independent.
Yes.
Not unlike our own.
Right.
And so I wondered if the activists or your own research could shed light on the role of the courts.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. Post-coup, or even before that, one way that the Erdogan was attempting to consolidate power was through constitutional referendum, through public opinion referendum on the Constitution. He knew that the courts couldn't be changed. If I remember correctly, there were 12 members of the Supreme Court initially, and many of them were separate from the AKP. So what he did was that he put in place a referendum that the public would vote on to give him more powers and increase the court from 12 to 17, the main Supreme Court. And he won. Because Turkey's very divided, not unlike US polarized society. About half the country is very pro-AKP, and about half the country despises the AKP. But historically, Erdogan has done very well economically, so he's gotten the majority of the votes, and he's been allowed to do this. And so yes, he stacked the deck, if you will, with now a lot of Islamist judges at the Supreme Court. He's tried to replace a lot of this at the municipality level as well. Some success, but yet there are still some challenges there. I'll give you one example. In Ankara, a couple years ago, now it's almost a couple years ago, where if I remember correctly, where the authorities in the capital put out a statement saying that no LGBTI activities could take place. Movies, films, meetings could not take place. Just recently, at the end of April, the court in Ankara overturned this. But it took a couple of years, but there is still some independence there. At the other hand, now I think a lot of activists, it seems, would be hesitant to go to the courts necessarily if they know that it's a pro-Erdogan based court. So that is a fear, absolutely. Whereas before this happened, they were much more willing to work through European law, through courts, now knowing that there are more sympathizers on the courts, even though judges are supposed to be impartial. That's not the case. And so they're taking different tactics because of that. You're absolutely right. That is an issue ongoing in Turkey. So I was pleased with seeing the reversal in Ankara, but it's not uniform across Turkey. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
So there's a lot of resonance in what you say about Turkey and what our domestic experiences are. But one question I have is whether there are researchers in Turkey who do work of the sort that the Williams Institute does to really study the lives of LGBT people and try to use those kinds of analyses to influence policy developments.
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, there are, but again, there's what there's very limited research from a scholarly perspective on LGBTI issues in the Middle East, because for quite some time it was taboo amongst many families to even talk about this issue, honor killings, etc. The community itself is, the activist movement is, as I mentioned, a couple of decades old. So you have some activist scholars who have been working on these issues and are now sharing this research and information. Some are independent, and then some work with organizations such as Amnesty International, for example, or with European institutions who partner up with these Turkish scholars to talk about these issues. So yes, that is done. And this is something I do find more effective, that there are scholars who are working in tandem with activists and outside institutions, publishing joint reports to then be used in terms of strategy. But again, not as much as I would obviously argue in the United States. The history of scholarship is much more detailed than what we're seeing in Turkey or anywhere else in the Middle East for that matter. But there is some avenues there, absolutely. Yeah,
But they don't, there's no official collection of data about, I mean, I don't know if they do data collection across any segment of the population.
It's a great question. There are public opinion surveys that are done, but to my knowledge, whether they always ask LGBTI questions, I don't even believe so, no. So it's limited in that capacity as well, you're right. It's very difficult to even get that question asked to individuals, you're absolutely right. So there is a gap there. And so any ideas or thoughts as to how to bridge that, of course, I'd be interested here as well. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
You had mentioned that, you know, one of the, I guess one of the disconnects from like Western activism to what's happening in the Middle East right now is like the Western focus on marriage, right, and marriage equality.
Sure.
I guess, did any of the activists in the Middle East that you spoke to mention what other things Western activists could do to kind of be like less ethnocentric and more like intersectionally cognizant of what's happening there?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So it stemmed from this conversation on marriage equality, and we were having these conversations about, well, what role do you see Western organizations? And they said, look, we're not opposed to Western organization activism. What we don't like is when Western organizations, with the money, and this is a common narrative throughout history of Western activism, I would argue, that Western organizations with money are coming and setting the agenda. And that's their issue that they have, that they're not coming to sit down and say, here's what we're thinking, but what are your thoughts? What are issues that are important to you? And let's work on these issues. It's, well, we have these issues in mind, and this is where the funding is, and so we want to focus on this. We want to readdress this. We want to pay attention to this. And they get upset by that because so much of that dialogue is stemming from an outside perspective. As opposed to, again, from my interviews, it seemed to me that they were very open to the idea of working with organizations, coming down and saying, sitting down and saying, look, what do you need? Here's what we need. We need health. We need building space. We need helping us write grants, helping us with legislative advocacy. These are things we need. We accept that help. But when the narrative is, well, we're focusing on marriage, we're focusing on this issue repeatedly, then it loses trust. They don't know why they're doing it, who they're trying to appeal to in the West, and that bridge doesn't get built. And so yes, they're open to it without question, but there's a level of distrust. As the activists were saying, anyone who comes and asks, that's the first thing they want to talk about. Gay marriage. And they repeatedly told me, I have to iterate this again, we're not opposed to it. We just have when transgender individuals are getting killed, when honor killings are taking place, numerous cases of transgender individuals being beaten publicly, or police not doing thorough investigations, that's what we need to focus on, first and foremost in our mind. And yet outsiders are coming and saying, we want to do this, we want to focus on this. And it becomes complicated when money's tied into that. So yes, it's a great question. They're open to the help, they're open to the research. I mean, even when I approach them, you can sense a hesitancy. They want to know the angle, because they've told me stories about how they thought an interview was going to go a certain way in the sense of who they were speaking with, and it turned that they had an agenda in their discourse. I had to prove to them I was a scholar looking at this from a scholarly perspective. And that distrust is there. And so you have to build that trust the same way with organizations. You're right. And hopefully it's being done, or at least organizations are cognizant of it, but I do worry still that that is a lot of where the attention still is. Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Member. Yes, Al.
So, related to that, you're here in the States, right?
I am, yes.
So it strikes me though, when you talk about it, I understand why they would be unaware of the complexity of the debates around gay marriage as an agenda, but for you, in your writing and in your research, do you draw connections between their concern with the overemphasis on marriage with the actual debates that have happened in the States for the last 20,
Right.
30 years? I mean, so the critiques they're making are not at all unlike the critiques that have happened along lines of race and class in the US. So, yeah, I was just wondering, like, do you talk about that? I don't know, I mean, your familiarity with the state's LGBT activism,
Yes.
and a lot of what they're saying resonates with existing critiques that are already here.
Yeah, and I'd be interested if you feel otherwise. You're absolutely right. I felt, and they're not complete parallels, but I really did feel that I was looking, if I can say this, I was looking backwards in time 20, 30 years to probably very similar to what was happening here, and how I think the discourse is going to change in Turkey similarly to how it changed here. That would be my prediction based on talking to them. The situation is a little bit different given the reign of the Islamists, maybe even more direct role of religion than possibly here, although I'd happily be corrected otherwise. But yeah, I didn't delve into it as much, but I do think there are those similarities as to make that counterpoint, but I didn't want to be the one making it in our conversations with them at that point.
Well, not to them, I meant
not to
like
them
as part of
afterwards. Yeah,
contextualizing the work.
yeah, I didn't say much in the book on the marriage issue, very limited to that. That was kind of a branch I was thinking of delving into later, and I still may go in that direction. I actually think I'm going to move to look at Albania, another Muslim country that has very little written on it. So I think that's where I would go. But there's a richness of scholarship available to make those comparisons. It's just time permitted. But I think you're absolutely right, and it's something that I think could help the activists there better contextualize it. Not that they're not aware, but I think I don't know if they're as nuanced, versed in it as scholars and activists here. And to make those linkages to say, look, we understand your position, but here's how it unfolded in the United States, and here's how it can still be useful to push that agenda, for example.
And to be clear, I'm actually not suggesting that they need to know. I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm thinking more just in terms of contextualizing your own scholarship and the fact that they have those critiques. It's probably useful to think about how we have a race and class divide around that emphasis on marriage. I actually find it very interesting that a lot of people of color and other groups working on poverty, you know, in the late 80s and early 90s, who were also critiquing the marriage focus, would have probably loved for the movement to have happened exactly the way it's happening in Turkey, not with regard to the level of oppression, but of starting with a continued focus on economic well-being, health access. So I mean, just to be clear, I'm talking more about on the scholarship end, not like what I wish they knew or they have to know about us. I think we'd actually have a lot to learn about the usefulness of staying focused on the most marginalized and not necessarily a focus on gay marriage. That's a lot of what came out of those critiques and where a lot of our work has tended to shift to now with the marriage part.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify, it wasn't so much like what I think they need to know from us.
No, but I think you're absolutely right, and there is sufficient space available to do that. I didn't touch on it very much in the book, only because of the other issues I focus on, but there's a rich place that I think you're exactly right on that would be useful in that context, absolutely.
What I think to further sort of complexify this discussion, it's not just a critique of marriage as an end, but many view marriage as actually a means to other ends.
Absolutely.
Related to family acceptance, related to reducing violence, related to
That was the argument.
advancing equal employment discrimination protections. The fact that our House of Representatives recently overwhelmingly passed a statute, or at least in the House of Representatives, passed legislation that would have added sexual orientation and gender identity to our federal civil rights statute. Some trace that widespread support to the efforts around marriage equality. So it's, I think, important to think about marriage not only as an end, but also as a means. At least that's some people's view. Other people certainly may not accept that strategy, but that certainly, as many of the activists in the United States view marriage in that way.
And I think there's potential to see that avenue in Turkey. So if you're an LGBT couple, you can't adopt, for example. But if you had a marriage law in place, that could be the stepping stone to then get you access to adoption, for example.
Certainly with respect to rights that flow from or connected to marriage, but I'm thinking more as a actual strategy around increasing LGBT acceptance was to
within society.
Within
Interesting.
society,
Sure.
to discuss LGBT relationships and love and commitment. Many believe was actually quite powerful in the U.S., moving U.S. society along.
Well, in one of the reports that we've done that you may have already looked at, but you can find it on our website, or Rachel can find it for you if you can't, was an analysis of levels of acceptance in different countries over 15 years or so, and sort of through some really sophisticated methodology. One of our colleagues sort of took surveys that were done at different times, asking different questions of different groups of people, and nonetheless managed to create some common rubric to compare them. But one of the things that was posited in that report is that whereas there had been this kind of dominant idea of the progression of LGBT rights in different countries, that you started with decriminalization and then you moved to economic rights and then you got to marriage at the end, that in fact the way that things have unfolded in different countries suggests that there are different models, and that some do start from the, do you know a gay person, and is that someone who is the parent of a child in your child's school, and that marriage and social acceptance actually do create a foundation for legal rights that flow differently from what I think the expected model was. So, and I can't remember exactly what it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't remember the stepping stones, but I think what was interesting, one of the things that was interesting about that report was the extent to which it suggested that there are different paths and that each of them has advanced rights in different countries in different ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really quick, just kind of hitting on the whole topic of marriage. So
Sure.
like, marriage is a social construct, right? Like, we're approaching marriage from a US perspective and what marriage means here, right? Across the world, marriage can mean very different things, whether you're looking at the global south, where you're looking at Western cultures, where you're looking at, what is it, you're looking at like Central American countries, things like that. Like, definitions of marriage change, right? So in Turkey, like, are there specific rights that are afforded to those that enter into like the marriage similar to here? Or like, I think one of the large issues that we have here, and a lot of people of color and people from lower socioeconomic status, is when such an emphasis is put on marriage, right? It's a very privileged right. It's also, a very kind of like heteronormative construct from the get-go. So what marriage is, what a relationship is, doesn't always fully ascribe to what LGBTQ people feel their relationship encompasses, just kind of based on how marriage was constructed and what's associated to it, right? So, I mean, is there kind of like a similar understanding of like a marriage contract there, or is it more like religiously based? Is it less, could it potentially really be a stepping stone into those new, into the new rights that are needed for the LGBTI folk there?
Yeah, that's another great question. So a lot of it is in public opinion in civil society. Much of it is very religious, cultural based.
Yeah.
That it's within Turkish culture, within Islamic culture, for individuals to get married, to have children. It's prescribed. There's sayings from the Prophet Muhammad for Muslims that marriage is half the faith is just getting married. I mean, it's embedded in this Islamic history of marriage. But then you do have these societal benefits within the Turkish state as well, as we talked about, whether it's adoption, whether it's protections with family. There are different benefits of being married as well. And so I would argue it's both within the secular law, but also within the religious tradition and foundation that marriage is this institutional based structure.
And since it's so, like, you know, since you said like half of the religion, you know, is pretty much like getting married, procreating, like, you know, it's very very significant. Similarly here, like, you know, with, you know, Judeo-Christian traditions, you know, getting married, procreating, it's all there. But do you think that there's maybe like a stronger religious influence in Turkey compared to here?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I do, within civil society, again, I do think that it's there. I think it's an element that marriage is a given within the Turkish and Islamic society. Again, so much of it goes from that Islamic structure. Because you hear these in Friday sermons or khutbahs where the imam will talk frequently about marriage and the importance of raising a family. That's continually perpetuated in a lot of Muslim societies. And so the activist strategy there, again, different approaches that can be taken, where that procreation argument, for example. Well, what a lot of scholars are doing, and a lot of activists are doing, are talking about the fact that within an Islamic framework, they're going back to the Quran, Islam's holy book. They're going back to the Hadith, the life of Muhammad, and saying, look, there are numerous passages where you argue Islam is about marriage and procreation, but the reality is quite the opposite. That Islam, for example, is very sex positive and not for procreation benefits. There's numerous references to the Quran that talks about relations and relations between individuals that doesn't need to lead to having children. And these are arguments that scholars and activists use to say, look, frequently we can go to the Quran and we can say marriage can be valuable, of course, but it doesn't need to be this way, and it doesn't need to lead to procreation. And so this is what scholars and a lot of activists are doing around the Muslim world, is that they're referencing back to the Quran, to these religious arguments, and arguing within that said space. So there's a scholar, Al-Haq Kugel, Scott Kugel is his last name, and he makes this point, for example, take the issue of transgender rights. Many individuals will say, well, Islam is opposed to transgender rights. Why? There's no support of this. Well, he and others have argued that there is support for transgender rights. One of Muhammad's wives was friends with an individual who was transgendered. The term was different, but our term today we would equate with transgender. And Muhammad allowed her friend in the space with women. And almost no one knows this story. And yet some Islamic scholars know it because the individual Muhammad eventually banned the individual from staying in the women quarters. And the scholars and the conservatives say, look, Muhammad banned the transgendered individual from being around his wife. Well, what they don't tell you is in that narrative that Muhammad allowed the transgender individual to be with the women until the transgender individual HIT was her name, started reporting what the woman looked like changing, for example, to the public. So they were in the private space, gossiping about what the female body looked like to others, and that's when Muhammad said, you can't, he didn't kill her, he didn't punish her, other than you can't be in the space with the women any longer. It's a very different narrative. Almost no one knows that Muhammad's wife had a transgendered friend. Conservatives don't want to talk about this. I don't think a lot of the progressive imams don't know about it. But if we use that narrative, we can go to what you're saying. You can start to look at the different ways marriage is structured, relationships are structured. I mean, you can take pages from Sufism that, if you look at the Quran, the Sufis, the Islamic mystics will say, when you look at the gender pronouns for God, they don't use he, she, because God is beyond that. Love is beyond gendered pronouns. And again, it's a mystical tradition, but Turkey mysticism is quite popular. So you can use that tradition to start being careful with how we use gender pronouns and talking about love as outside of gender pronouns. So these are ways that can be done, and it's starting to be done based on what you're exactly talking about as to how it's framed. What are the religious and secular benefits of marriage in Turkey? Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, you successfully brought up Sufism as
I did. Yes.
It's all connected. Well, we're so grateful to you for giving us this information and coming to talk to us, and I think we'd very much like to continue the conversation. As Adam mentioned, our research director, Kareth Conran, is actually looking for someone to review a paper that we've written based on public opinion surveys about transgender people in different countries.
Wonderful.
And so I think she'd like to talk to you about that, and we are going to be starting a new phase of our international work to try to create opportunities to work with scholars in different countries around the world to build capacity to do the kind of data analysis, data collection, policy impact work that we do. So we'd love to keep in touch about that too.
No, I'm again grateful for your time. I know you're all very busy with all your important work, so thank you, each and every one of you, for taking the time. And of course, I'd be happy to help in any way that I can with that paper, or if I can help in any way with the international direction of the Institute as it relates to the Muslim world, for example, and LGBT rights. Please never hesitate to let me know. So, thank you, everyone.